So, you started your business, you need to expand, you're thinking of employing an individual, maybe your second, maybe your third, maybe your fourth. What are the key things you need to think about? Hopefully on this whistle-stop tour of a few of the documents you really should have in place, this will help you. The offer letter, that's the starting point. You've been to a recruitment agency, they've provided you an excellent candidate or a list of candidates, you've selected the person you want, now you're going to offer them the job. That letter should say exactly what the job entails, pretty basic stuff. Excuse me. I would advise when you send the offer letter, you send your draft contract of employment with it. You can do it on the first day of induction, that's what we do at Nicholsons, but it's important you don't forget to actually issue the contract of employment. The other question is, do you ask for references? Probably being a bit old-fashioned here, but I would always ask for a reference. But be careful how you word it. I would always say the job is conditional on receiving references satisfactory to the business, which is a slightly different way of saying we require satisfactory references, because who can define what a satisfactory reference is? Mute point, but very careful to word it correctly. Also, during that period with your offer letter, I would include some sort of documentation that requires the individual to bring in their passport or some other documentation to show that they've got the right to work in the UK. One word of caution here, don't fall into a discrimination trap. Always look at passports and documentation for all your employees. Nicholsons have a guy who's worked for us, one or two guys who have worked for us for many years. One individual has been with us for over 40 years. He did look a bit strange at me when I asked him if he got the right to work in the UK, but I was being fair to everybody and not discriminating. So then we need to look at the contract of employment. Many people don't bother, or they don't pay enough attention to the contract of employment. This is the basis, this is a starting point. First thing is, do you have a written statement of particulars, or do you have a contract of employment? What I would say is, failure to provide at least a statement of particulars within 8 weeks of commencement could lead to a fine up to 4 weeks statutory money. So it's worth getting the contract of employment in place, if only to avoid that. Now, you may ask, well, what's the difference between a statement of particulars employment and a contract of employment? They do tend to say very similar things. Name of the employer, name of the employee, date of employment, continuous employment status, job location, pay details, etc., etc., etc. And to be honest, if you was to go to a tribunal, then at least a statement does set out some certain things. However, the main difference is a written statement is usually provided to you by the employer to the employee. So they are told what the terms are. A contract is more of, it's an agreement tailored to the individual where both parties have read it, both parties have signed it. So it's got that little bit of more credibility to it. Word of caution, there are many of these contracts of employment and written statements on the internet. You can, if you wish, print one off, but be very careful. I have had quite a large client come to me and showed me their contract of employment, which they'd extracted from the internet, which said this works under the rules of Florida, USA. Not going to help you in the UK employment law. So I would suggest that you do get a statement or a contract drafted, tailored to your business. So when you've decided what sort of document you want, you then got to determine the type of contract of employment. This will depend on the type of employee and what type of work you've got. You can have full-time permanent, part-time permanent, temporary, which is a fixed term, part-time temporary. Any of these sort of things, depending on the type of employee you have and how you want to work with them. There is also the 0 hours contract. Now, that has received an awful lot of bad publicity in the past. Unfairly, in my opinion, there is absolutely nothing wrong with a well-drafted 0 hours contract. You must have an exclusivity clause in there, but it is a type of contract that may be beneficial to your business as you're starting to grow and you're unsure of how many hours you can provide that individual. You can also have a casual agreement, and in some cases the casual and the 0 hours contract would be very similar. It was good to hear Mike speaking previously, because I'm going to mention something he mentioned, and that is, if you're in a company or in a partnership, you need to seriously think about directors' service agreements, shareholders' agreements, and partnership agreements. It's always good to get these documents in place at the outset when the sun is shining and everything in the garden is rosy. Because if you haven't got these documents in place, unfortunately human beings do tend to have little disagreements or falling out or whatever you want to call it, and where do you go from there? And that's where it can be very, very expensive to sort out disputes. So my advice is get those sort of documents in place. And some of you may have some quite complex shareholder agreements. Mike was there, he was talking about these in more detail. One of the more recent things to think about as you get your first employee is auto-enrolment. Have a look at what type of auto-enrolment you have, because that clause needs to be inserted into the contract of employment. Not all clauses are the same. You also need to consider the status of the employee. That's interesting. I work with a very good tax consultant, head of tax at Nicholsons, Colin McCoy. I'm head of HR, I come under employment law, he comes under tax laws. There are times when we have, how should we put it, intellectual discussion, shall we say, or maybe heated arguments or whatever. But we both follow the law, but our interpretations can be different. So we both can be 100% correct, but looked at from the other person's eyes may not be. So be careful on your interpretation of status, especially when it comes to self-employed, the employee, and the worker. You will have seen lots of stuff in the papers and the television recently with workers, Uber, Deliveroo. It's still in much of a state of flux. I'm sure as years come, the months come, it'll get sorted out. Still a bit of confusion. The vast majority of people you're going to employ will be employees. It's only occasionally you trip into the worker scenario. A question I get asked many times is a handbook. Do you need one? Well, I would say it's up to you. But, and that but is, be careful, because where else are you going to demonstrate what your policies and procedures are? At the very least, if you don't want to go down the path of a fully documented employee handbook, at least have a disciplinary and grievance process. For my clients, if they don't want to have the handbook, then I would attach them to the contract as appendices A and B. They are not contractual documents, but at least you've got those policies in place. Now, a couple of things I'm just going to talk about now. It varies at which stage you do this. I would recommend you do, let's catch up. Determine what you actually want somebody to do. The job description. Definition is, it's a written account of all the duties and responsibilities involved in a particular job or position. There are many, many different types available on the internet. I tend to go for an objective-based job description. Other people go with a task-based one. It really depends on how you feel and the feel, what you really prefer there. The other one is, what type of person do you need? And for that, you would need what's called a person specification. There's the definition there. The skills, Sorry about that. The skills that a job holder must have in order to complete the task of a position required by the business. Just bear with me. Are we back live again? Okay. Ideally, you really should have your job description and your person specification drafted before you start to interview. Lots of recruitment can go wrong because quite simply you've not looked at what type of person you want and what you want them to do. By going through this exercise, we'll try to help you ensure you get the right person for the job that you have. Then when you've got them, you've got the contract, all is in place, then you've got the more serious job. What do you do if they don't do what you want them to do? Occasionally that does happen, and that's what helps keep me employed. You really need to have a performance management system. It doesn't have to be complex, but some sort of method where you try and explain to the person what you want them to do and how you want them to do it. Now, you've probably all heard that within 2 years of employment, less the statutory notice, you can undertake what is known as a short-term dismissal, because employees under 2 years cannot go to a tribunal for unfair dismissal. Be careful. There are 20-odd ways to still go to a tribunal under a short-term definition. It can involve things like discrimination, harassment, bullying, any of those types of things. So you need to be careful if you're going to dismiss somebody within 2 years. It's worth a quick phone call to somebody like myself, just to say, am I okay here? And there are times when you think it's obvious you need to get rid of that person. I may just say, just hold fire. We need to just clarify a few things here. So beware. Then you need to decide how much you're going to pay them. I suppose that's helped because there's the national minimum working wage, so you need to think of that. As I've already mentioned, you need to check to make sure they are allowed to work in the UK. Trust me, some of the fines are pretty astronomical if you get that bit wrong. One thing I would just say about payroll, paying people, if you've got 1 or 2 employees, you will be doing a payroll probably once a month or once a week, not very regularly. It's getting to be a little bit more complex than it used to be. If you go to a payroll bureau, they do payroll, and nothing but payroll. They become very good at this sort of thing. Whilst you're busy in that first year, first 2 years, 3 years of getting your business off the ground, if there's one task you want to outsource and get off your plate, that's the one. Payroll is the one I would really recommend you pass to a payroll bureau. There are quite a few out there. You also need to check with, so you may need a DBS check with some occupations. Security and caring, those types of occupations, you sometimes need to get the DBS check. Used to be called CRB. And also, if you're going to start employing people, you will need employer's liability insurance. So a good insurance broker to work with you is also very useful to have. A quick word about what many people would say the dreaded health and safety, but I wouldn't see it like that. Always work with health and safety rather than against it. Every business has to do some form of risk assessments. It's only when you get to 5 or more people that you have to start documenting it. My logic tells me, well, if you've got to do risk assessments, and you might have to prove them to somebody at some point, why not just go and write them down? It doesn't take that much extra. They're not particularly difficult, you just need to go through a process. If you've got pretty basic ones, come and have a chat with me. There's a guy here, Chris Owens here today. He can do more specialist type work. We're here to help you. So, last but not least, in your quest, in your business as it grows, probably the most important aspect is, but everybody would say this about their occupations, have a very good, experienced human resources person and a health and safety person working alongside you, somebody you can call at the drop of a hat. I wonder where you'd get one of those from. Thank you very much.